It's really my great pleasure to be having this conversation with Dr. Harold Varmus in Bangladesh here. We heard a bit about your life story right now, but if I may, I'd like to go back to where it all started. Perhaps like to hear something about maybe your upbringing and where you grew up and your family.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, and let me extend my thanks to the organizers of this festival and to all of you for coming out. It's been my first visit to Bangladesh, and despite the slightly tense political situation that obtains here, it's been a great pleasure for me to have a chance to do everything from attend a number of very stimulating events here, to see the Louis Kahn buildings, and to have a chance to spend some time in one of the important countries of South Asia that I have not been able to visit before, even though I've spent a great deal of time in India. So let me get back to the question that was raised. I don't want to go into great detail, but my own development as a scientist and as an individual living in America exemplifies some of the important principles that imperfect as our country is, characterize life in the U.S. First of all, I am basically the product of immigration, like many of my fellow Americans, nearly all of them. My grandparents came from Eastern Europe. They were Jews who were persecuted in a number of countries, in Poland and Austria-Hungary, and they came before World War II. One family, my mother's family, was a lower middle class family. My father's family was frankly poor, farmers, factory workers. My father grew up in a very poor neighborhood in Newark, New Jersey, but was able to get a scholarship to Harvard, and then went on to medical school and became a solid member of the middle class as a practitioner physician on the South Shore of Long Island. My mother grew up in somewhat better circumstances, but her parents, relatively uneducated, were able to send her to Wellesley College, and she became a psychiatric social worker. I was a beneficiary of their success and their relative well-being. Went off to college with an unclear indication of what I really wanted to do. There was an expectation that I should become a physician like my father, but the world was open. And the second point I'd like to make about my own development is that it's characteristic of a world in which there's always a second chance. You can always change your mind and do something different. So I was not obligated to say I was definitely committed to medicine when I began my career, began my college career. Instead, I could go off. I got a very liberal education, and all of us at that time are required to take courses in history and literature, mathematics and science. We all got a firm grounding in the major truths of civilization.
Tell us a bit about your interest in literature, though, because you first started studying medicine, and then.
Well, no, I didn't. I went to college to take not medicine, but basic science courses that would allow admission to medical school. It's a separate idea, and I think it's important to understand that in the U.S. you don't go to college already committed to a career. You go perhaps to get requirements to go on to graduate work or to professional school. But along the way, because I was getting such a broad background, and because I had always been interested in fiction and literature in general, I became somewhat seduced by literature and saw that as a possible career path. I was the editor of the school paper at Amherst College. I did a thesis on Charles Dickens. My closest friends at school were people interested in poetry and fiction. By the time I was ready to graduate, I was also ready to say, I'm at least going to set medical school aside and pursue the possibility of being a literary critic and professor of English. Went off to graduate school. There was support for my doing that from a foundation. It was only after I went to graduate school and saw that that profession might make me feel somewhat limited, and that the science part of my brain was going to die in a literary career, and my friends at medical school were having a better time than I was, that I began to entertain the idea of going back to the idea of pursuing medicine, which I did, and in part because medicine opened a lot of doors. Gertrude Stein, the writer and art connoisseur, made the point in her own autobiography that she went to medical school because medicine seemed to open all doors, and it did seem to me that many kinds of careers were possible. Indeed, as I reflect back on my own still unfinished career, I like to think that medicine did prepare me, even though I never really practiced medicine, for being a scientist, being an institutional leader, being involved in politics, doing a number of things in the developing world, and all of that came out of a basis of understanding human biology and the importance of health.
So, I think you practiced medicine for a bit, and you came to India as in a missionary.
Well, there's some anomalies there. First of all, I was still a medical student, so I wasn't really practicing medicine. I was still training. I was interested in what we now call global health. We then called it tropical disease. I wanted to go to India because I was fascinated by India. This is 1966. Bangladesh did not yet exist as an independent country. In fact, I began my trip to India by going to Bengal, to Calcutta. And though obviously the partition had occurred, the independence of Bangladesh had not yet occurred. And I worked in a mission hospital, not because I was a missionary in any sense. In fact, I've always been fairly uninterested in religion, but I was there because it was a place that someone had told me they would allow a medical student to come and spend some time. And indeed, it was a kind of fascinating experience. Many poor people coming to this mission hospital to seek medical care from all over the northern part of Uttar Pradesh. And it was fairly close to Delhi. I was able to travel on weekends to many places in India. And it was the birthplace of my own love for India, its diversity, its incredible energy, the fascination of living in a place that had such a wide range of talents and economic level and cultural histories.
And then let's talk a bit about, after that, your interest and your involvement in the basic sciences.
Well, that became one of the things I was hoping to emphasize along the way, is the fact that especially in America, it's always possible to change course. So I had been trained somewhat in literature. I'd been trained in medicine. I'd spent some time abroad. I had a couple of years of training in a major hospital in New York City. And at that point, the U.S. was embroiled in a very unpopular war, the Vietnam War. Virtually, we had a draft at that time. Medical graduates were subjected to the draft. I had to do some kind of service or leave the country. I didn't want to serve in Vietnam. I didn't want to go to jail. I didn't want to leave the country. But there was one way that I could serve my purpose of my country's purpose without actually supporting the war, and that was by serving in the public health service. That meant, for most of us, going to the National Institutes of Health, which then had a very strong training program in science. And I was fortunate enough to be matched with a young physician scientist who was doing very basic research, research on the genetics of bacteria involving efforts to understand how genes are controlled at a very early time in the history of molecular biology, when our techniques were very primitive. There was no DNA cloning, there was no DNA sequencing. The kinds of tools we have available now were not available then. But the excitement of the basic questions was palpable and important. And over the course of 2 years, from the age of 28 to the age of 30, I basically changed my entire perspective on life. I realized that what I'd been thinking of as science in high school and college was textbook learning. I wasn't learning about frontiers. Facts are dull. What we don't know is exciting. And when I was in a laboratory and actually doing experiments myself, I began to get the fever of a scientist who cares about opening doors to see what is unknown. And that changed my life dramatically. And at that point I said, I'm not going to get further training in clinical medicine. Instead, I'm going to seek ways to do additional kinds of science that was perhaps more relevant to my training in medicine. And at that time in my life, one of the questions that seemed not just important and fascinating, but also possible to probe and with new techniques was the question of what is responsible for the conversion of a normal human cell into a cancer cell. We knew that permanent changes occurred relatively quickly. We had very poor understanding of how that happened, but there were new tools in science that made it seem possible to try to understand how a normal cell could completely change its behavior.
So, to tell us a bit about, the excitement or the sort of trials and tribulations, and then finally, being able to elucidating some of the answers.
Yes, well, I don't want to spend too much time on that. I think this is an occasion for us to talk about personal things and about politics and other aspects of science, and about science in South Asia. But in a nutshell, the major tool that was available for trying to understand how a normal cell became a cancer cell was to make use of viruses that occurred in animals that induced cancers in those animals and could change the behavior of a cell growing in a simple dish in a laboratory. Those viruses were quite simple genetically, having only a few genes, and it was possible to identify the gene responsible for converting a normal cell to a cancer cell. Those genes turned out to be derived from normal cellular genes, and the cellular genes that gave rise to the viral cancer genes are the genes that are among the most important to undergo the mutations that lead to human cancer. So now, looking back on a discovery that was made in the mid-1970s, it's possible to trace very clearly how some of our new therapies for cancer that specifically target the proteins made by these mutant genes was derived from that earlier work. Now we have much more powerful tools. We can identify every gene that's been mutated in a cancer cell. We have a much broader number of targets to think about in developing new kinds of therapies. We have, as I discussed in my lecture 2 days ago, we have new ways to think about changing the immune system to react to those mutant proteins. So the field of cancer treatment, while very far from reaching its full glory, has changed dramatically in the last couple of years, thanks to the opportunities that were made available through basic science 40 years ago.
So, you did the basic science, but you've also run two major public institutions as well as private institution. And maybe you could talk a bit about how you feel that has been important.
Yes, well, in some ways, my life has been a very unexpected one in the sense that I'm not somebody who tolerates going to meetings and listening to other people. My wife thinks of me as a very impatient person. She used to ask me, you always avoid meetings. Why did you become head of these institutions? But the fact is that when you run the institutions, you decide when the meetings are over and you decide when you're going to have a meeting. But the opportunity to lead an institution that has resources, has money, has smart people, and try to influence the way in which science develops, the way in which people get trained, the way in which scientists get mobilized to pursue a variety of things from genome projects to global health to better understanding of infectious disease. These kinds of decisions are important and, in my view, should not be left to bureaucrats. There should be decisions made by people who understand the field. So for 22 years, I ran institutions, and I loved doing that.
I mean, I think we were talking about earlier, and this distinction we have between administrators and scientists, and it's like, there's one, especially a lot of the way modern institutions are run, they have the managers and then they have the scientists.
Right.
But I think we were talking a bit about your feelings about that you can't separate the two, which you just mentioned.
Well, I think the important thing is not to be, when you become the leader of an institution, do not become a bureaucrat and an administrator. I mean, there are people who help people like me to run institutions because they They keep the books. They advise me about how the finances of the institution are faring. They help to negotiate the legal aspects of how an institution is run. But I strongly believe that institutions should be led by people who understand the basic tenets of the field, that whether it's education or some political organization or a science organization. The leader should be somebody who is intimate with and passionate about the field itself. You can always get help from people to be sure that the institution has financial integrity, is politically appropriate, has moral integrity, and the job of the person who is the leader is to set down principles, set out ambitions, say, here's where we're going, follow me.
So what do you think you achieved, or are you proud of any particular thing that you achieved when you were running the NIH and the Cancer Research Institute?
Well, in every case, when I've gone to run a new institution, and I've done that 3 times, I always start by saying, here's what I'd like to achieve over the next 5 years or so. In the case of running and I'll just give one set of examples, but when I went to the National Institutes of Health, there was a lot of discouragement about ability to get money to support research grants. The budget wasn't doing all that well. There was a lack of conviction about doing clinical research. And while I was, over the course of the 6 years that I was there during the Clinton administration, we were able to start a doubling of the NIH budget by persuading members of Congress, the administration, the public, that science is critical to the development of U.S. from various points of view. Better health, stronger economy, nurturing the intellectual leadership of the country, increasing national pride and prestige. And all of these things resonated with the political system that ultimately has to support an institution like the National Institutes of Health. And I hope we come back to this theme because I think it's important to think about the role that science plays in the life of a country, and to think about how in Bangladesh, and in fact throughout South Asia, science could play a more prominent role than it does. But in addition to worrying about the budget of NIH when I was there, we also worried about rebuilding clinical research, finding congressional support for building buildings that needed to be, had to be constructed to provide space for our scientists to work. A lot of attention given to recruiting the very best people to come and run the several institutes that constitute the National Institutes of Health. So there's a lot of work to do in these kinds of jobs, but setting out some overall programs for improving the fate of women in science, including minorities in science. One of the things that may not be appreciated at a distance from the US, but is very troubling to us, is that we have very significant minority populations, and with the exception of Asians who do reasonably well, our African Americans and Hispanic populations do not produce as many scientists as we'd like, and that's an ongoing struggle.
The other issue that you've raised is, the importance of government, public funding for basic science, and also touching on also the importance of industry coming on and how it can work well, what works and what doesn't, or what good practices and bad practices of these kind of scenarios. So maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Well, in the U.S., although we provide a great deal of money for our scientific institutions, like the National Institute of Health or the National Science Foundation or the Department of Energy, what is always critical in thinking about the financing of science is whether the budgets are going up or down. And for the last 12 years or so, the budget of the National Institutes of Health has been declining in constant dollars. We've lost about 25% of our buying power, and that's also been true for other science agencies. That has a very strong detrimental effect on the enthusiasm of young people for going into science, for the well-being of people who are doing science. Science has gotten more expensive. The amount of money we have to pay for it has declined. And when that happens, people get very conservative about what science they support. They're less likely to support free-ranging, curiosity-driven basic science and instead focus on things that seem like immediate needs, making new drugs, doing things that seem to have an immediate impact on improving the nation's health, for example, as opposed to making the long-range investments that will make a difference 30 or 40 years from now. So, yes, as you mentioned, science is conducted not just from government funds. There's a fair amount of money provided by philanthropy, something which is one of the unique attributes of the U.S. Even in Europe, philanthropy doesn't play quite as large a role as it does in the U.S., but that is an important feature of the landscape for supporting science. And then the other major component, a much larger one, is, as you point out, the industrial component. But it must be remembered that companies have short-term financial goals, and very few American companies at this point are making investments in the kind of basic research that is so critical to the value that science brings to the country. For example, we were talking earlier today about the history of AIDS in our country. It turns out that the basic research that allowed us to confront HIV, the cause of AIDS, really began before AIDS was ever seen, before the HIV virus was discovered, with investments in a class of viruses known as retroviruses. And during the course of the 1960s and 70s, the NIH put a lot of money into its efforts to understand retroviruses because they were the cause of cancer in animals. Then when HIV was discovered and it was found to be a retrovirus, the country was quite well prepared for taking the next steps and identifying the aspects of retroviral behavior and biology that led to the development of the drugs that are now familiar to many of you as the components of highly effective antiretroviral therapy. And that sometimes is used for complaints that industry should not make so much money from these drugs. But that's unfair too, because making the drugs and testing the drugs is an expensive enterprise. I would totally agree that those drugs were too expensive initially, but companies are determined to serve their stockholders, and they're determined to extract as much money as they can from a new drug before the patent runs out. But in the overall history, things worked out not far from perfectly, but reasonably well. And as drugs become cheaper and cheaper, more and more people benefit. I think there are ways to make those transitions occur more swiftly, but
well, talking about commercial interests in science, one area that you're very outspoken on is sort of access to information and access to sort of scientific knowledge
Yes.
and discoveries and papers. Perhaps you could talk a bit about.
Well, thank you for bringing that up, because one of the things that I like to point out to my friends who are professional writers and who are, of course, concerned all the time about the editing and publishing of their work is that we as scientists are also deeply concerned with the publication of our work. If our work is not published, nobody knows we did it. It has no meaning. So publication is the lifeblood of science, but the perspective that we have on publication is extremely different. I've written hundreds of papers. I've never gotten paid a penny for any of them. I edit journals. I review manuscripts for publication. I don't get paid for that. The only organizations that make money from the publication of science are the professional publishers, either publishers of the classical sort or scientific societies that publish work and actually have a lock on the publication process that I've spent a lot of time trying to undermine. Scientific publication really began in the late 17th century when initially the Royal Society began publishing papers that were reviewed by other people and then put into a journal. And before that, people wrote books, took years and years and years for publication to occur. And over the course of the years of classical journal-based publication processes, all conducted with the classical Gutenberg-type press. That's the way the system worked, and it worked reasonably well. But with the introduction of the internet, new kinds of dissemination of scientific information became possible. And I and some of my colleagues felt very strongly that we needed to have a kind of revolution in the way science information is treated. First of all, building digital public libraries that make science available to all. After all, the government largely pays for the science. That means citizens pay for the science, and citizens should have access to what they paid for. And we at the NIH built a digital library that we asked journals to contribute to within 6 months to a year after official publication in a journal. Perhaps more important development was the development of what we call open access publishing, with a totally different business model for publishing, a model in which the costs of publication are covered by the funding agency providing to investigators money to use to pay for those publication costs. And then when a paper is published and it's in digital form, it goes onto the internet with totally free access by everyone who's anywhere in the world. And I emphasize anywhere in the world because one of the things I hope we have a chance to talk about is the democratizing and coalition building integration function of the scientific process. Scientists speak a common language. That language is in general English, but a more important thing is that we have a common language that is about the science itself. And science is inherently international. What's true of biology in Russia and in China and in India is also true in the US. And scientists who go to international meetings provide part of the call it the cultural infrastructure that gives coherence to nations and helps to support the kind of integration that was being talked about this morning in the session on South Asia.
Well, perhaps we could talk about this a bit now, about your thoughts about third world country like Bangladesh. You've done a lot of work in India, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I believe that science should be important in every country, in part because rationally based, evidence-motivated drawing of conclusions is an incredibly important way for nations to try to solve their problems. And teaching science, even to people who go on to do other things, I think is an incredibly important way to think about life. It doesn't mean that religion's not important, that history's not important, but evidence-based thinking is, I think, a crucial way to deal with the problems that we all face. Secondly, we shouldn't fool ourselves to thinking that every nation that engages in the scientific process needs to be running a Hadron Collider or doing the most sophisticated modern genetic research. There are many, many problems in science that can be solved and should be solved by the countries that have the greatest need. Bangladesh is a country that is perhaps most threatened in the world by climate change. Bangladesh has remarkable diversity of plant and animal species and should have a very rich scientific cohort that's worrying about the effects of modernization on the environment in which these plants and animals survive. And then Bangladesh is a country of 160 million people, sixth largest country in the world. It makes a very small impact on medical research, and I think that effect could be much greater. How does that happen? Well, it's not easy, but there is a tremendous interest everywhere I go in the more advanced economies in the US and in Europe in developing collaborations, partnerships with poorer countries that have aspirations to do science. It does require political commitment, and in my experience trying to promote global science through the Gates Foundation or through efforts made by the National Cancer Institute, the countries we work with most effectively are those in which the finance minister, the prime minister, science ministers are all committed to the idea of creating collaborative opportunities for research, making of making money available for the support of research. It does happen, and the result is the development of new discoveries and in my own field, richer healthcare system. I'm fond of the relationship that's existed between the U.S. and Uganda over the last 50 or so years, beginning with the discovery of a disease called Burkitt lymphoma in East Africa, and followed by the development of a Uganda Cancer Institute, supported and partnered with the National Cancer Institute. And over the years, many important things have happened there, including the training of a cohort of outstanding Uganda medical scientists who then work in close collaboration with people in the U.S. who serve our national cancer centers.
So talking of cancer, I mean, you gave a great talk the other day, but where are we at with cancer right now?
Well, everyone's interested in cancer, and as I pointed out the other day, we used to think 30 or 40 years ago about cancer as though it's one disease. And of course, we now understand that every kind of cancer is different. It occurs at different frequencies in different countries. It's caused by different kinds of events that change our genomes. The genes that are changed are different, and we can no longer say we're winning or losing a battle against cancer simply by saying yes or no. We have to say which cancer are we talking about, in which country, and we also have to recognize that much of the improvement that occurs is incremental. It's not dramatic. It's not as though one day we couldn't do anything about the cancer, the next day we could do a lot. There's prevention, there's screening for early cancer, there are various kinds of therapies that range from traditional surgeries to more modern molecular targeted therapies and immunotherapies. And all of these have to be taken into consideration. One of the things that I think is important to recognize in a country like Bangladesh is that your demographics have changed dramatically, as they have in many of the developing countries. Infant mortality is markedly reduced. You have much better control of infectious disease. Life expectancy is increased. And it isn't as though the diseases of later life, heart disease, diabetes, and cancer in particular, are resistant to affordable prevention and therapeutic strategies. Many developing countries, especially as people develop better incomes, are afflicted by all the diseases associated with tobacco. That's not just cancer, that's also cardiovascular and lung disease. And tobacco control is something that governments with a will can take on, and that happens especially effectively when tobacco is not a major export product. But there are other prevention maneuvers that are potentially very beneficial to the country's health. And then there are many things that can be done to treat cancer, to provide protection from pain, and to do take on a number of other measures that are effective and have been proven to be effective over the years in cancer treatment. And they can be made available here. And it's just a matter of building the partnerships with other countries, having more individuals sent abroad to learn what is latest in cancer research and treatment that can be a major benefit to your country.
You know, one of the, I will hope that, you know, you'll be back many more times, and perhaps we can go forward with some of the ideas you have. But one thing I wanted to, you mentioned it at the beginning, but the sort of other side of you, when I mentioned Bangladesh, one of the reasons that you know, interested you was actually seeing the Louis Kahn building. And I was wondering what your interest in Louis Kahn and architecture.
Well, I do have a general interest in architecture per se, but my interest in Louis Kahn was stimulated, as I think is true of many people here and elsewhere, by a wonderful movie called My Architect that was made by his son. I was very familiar with his architecture because one of the great buildings in America is the building that houses the Salk Institute, a research institute near San Diego. And I did not know that he had made this magnificent Parliament building that looks like it's floating in the lake in the middle of Dhaka. And so one of the great treasures of this trip has been a chance to take a tour of the interior of the building and see how remarkable this structure is.
And was just, I'd like to also know about your other interests, because I think, I believe your son is a jazz musician, and you have other interests as well. Maybe you can talk about sort of your other half of your brain, if that's the way, or
I'm not sure
the
about
other
the other
side
half,
of your
the
interests.
intermingled part. But I do think that what I do in my spare time is probably not of great interest to people in the audience. But I think there is an important point to be made about the fact that that scientists are not inhuman, and they're not, and they have the same deep cultural interests as everybody else. My colleagues in science, yes, they love their science and they're smart people, but they all have interests in music and theater and other parts of culture and athletics. In my own case, I'm passionate about cycling, not simply because cycling is great exercise, but I think it's an important component of urban life. And I've been very happy to see New York City quite transformed by the creation of bike lanes throughout the city, bike paths up and down the Hudson River, the availability of a bike share program. So I now have a card that allows me to take a bike and go across town and park it in some city, in a bike rack provided by the city. So there are aspects of even athletic life that prove to be political in a sense. But I do think that just as it is important to recognize that scientists have a lot of cultural interests, to recognize that people who are in other spheres of life ought to have some fundamental training in science. This has been a topic of discussion ever since C.P. Snow articulated the notion of two cultures. I find the two-culture idea a little simplistic, but it is troubling to me when my friends expect me to know a lot of Shakespeare, which I do, and yet they don't feel an obligation to understand the basic tenets of life processes, molecular biology, these great, wonderful things that tell us how life works, how evolution occurred, and
I think that's perhaps your thoughts on why you would come to a literature festival. Why should there be science at a literature festival?
Well, there ought to be more, frankly, because a rendition of science in a way that is lively, entertaining, educational, and of course published is as much. There is poetry in what we do, and we should spend some time thinking about that and trying. It does take some work on the part of the scientists. Many of my friends have not thought that much about how they're going to communicate the technical details of their work to the public. Well, you can't communicate those. You have to find ways to reach out to the public to help them understand what a scientific idea is, how it gets validated, how it gets applied. And it's the magic of putting together those things that allow you to communicate to an audience why science is important, why science is multicultural, why science is a way of bringing countries together by bringing people together, and why the benefits of science are not only important, they're probably critical to the future of our species. Many friends of mine are surprised to hear me say that I don't think that medical research is at this point the critical science for the survival of our species. Our species is now dependent on finding answers to sources of energy, to at least adaptation to climate change, if not means to control it. And if we don't, as a species, begin to understand how dependent we are on energy, how critical it is to reduce the greenhouse gases that we're putting into the environment, how we're going to adapt to the changes that will almost inevitably occur over the next 50 years, that we are deeply threatened. Population control, better sources of energy, adaptation to the impact that we're already having on our environments are the things that are going to determine how we do as a species, not whether or not we can find ways to extend life by another few years, even though obviously all of us desire to live long and healthy lives, and I've committed my life to trying to help with that. But right now, what really threatens us is a wholly different set of scientific notions that every nation in the world should be contributing to, because we're all threatened by what is looming in front of us, and politicians have a hard time seeing it because they need to get votes this year, and people want to have a healthy economy, more energy, more access to consumer goods, many of which are resulting in the increase in greenhouse gases that are imperiling our existence.
Well, I think we can open the floor up to a few questions. If anyone has any questions.
You need a microphone.
I need a microphone. Thank you very much for your comments, Dr. Varmus. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about what do you think is the role of literature, and maybe of the type of literature you've written, not scientific, I mean your books, in advancing science or in society in the sort of scope of science? Because you've talked about how important science is for society, but how does that intersect with that type of literature?
Right. Well, of course, there are many ways to present science through literature. There are people who write brilliant histories of science. I think that it can be one form of literature. I pointed out the other day that the Bengali-derived American Siddhartha Mukherjee has made a real contribution to cancer research by writing a very vivid account of the history of many aspects of cancer treatment and research. There are famous novelists like Somerset Maugham who've been trained as physicians and have incorporated medicine into the way they describe their versions of life. And then many of us have written memoirs in which we try to explain how our careers developed and what kind of work we've done in a way that is compelling. It's not easy, but there are some great biographies. I would cite the biography of Francois Jacob. The Statue Within is perhaps the most beautifully written of all of them, and also exciting renditions of discovery like Jim Watson's book, The Double Helix, all of which I think give a remarkably accessible and compelling account of what it's like to do science to a public that often thinks that science is very mechanical. You take a machine, you put in something, and you get a number out, and you interpret it. But actually, science is a much more human activity, and I think expressing the nature of that activity is a crucial way to explain to the public, especially the young part of the public, which is making decisions about how to live. I frequently interview students who are applying to medical school or PhD programs, and I'm always amused by students who say, I like people, so I'd like to be a doctor, but I also like science, so I'm going to apply for a PhD program too. And I tell them, when you're a practicing physician, you're not really engaging in human relationships. You have a patient in your office. It's a human relationship, but it's a very dependent relationship. The patient is anxious and looking for advice. But when you're in a laboratory, you're not by yourself. You're with your students and postdocs and technicians, and you're creating a society in which the interactions among all its components is, to my mind, much more like a normal community, and one that is much more dependent on traditional people skills.
Any other questions?
Professor Varmus, I was wondering whether you'd comment on the role of the scientist as a public intellectual, especially since you brought up this issue that in this age of climate change, and the real concern is that there is a real scenario of impending doom, and there seems to be a complete disconnect of politicians from the data that is being generated. And I'm also trying to sort of link this to some of the work by Paul Krugman, who, as a Nobel Prize-winning economist, writes a weekly column in the New York Times. And when he was asked as to
Twice a week.
twice a week, actually, and he says that it's important for academics to influence the public policy debate. And it seems to be much more common in the social sciences for academics to get involved in the public sphere. There seems to be a bit of a conflict among scientists about whether that's their legitimate role, which is very different from the historical notion of. So I was wondering whether, because you've done a fair bit of trying to, demystify science, and could you comment on that?
Yes, that's a very important point you're raising, and I do know there are colleagues in science who would prefer not to go public, not to go out and make public statements. But I think it does cut two ways, because many of my colleagues do want to express their views, and they don't find the vehicles to do so. I'm here because I was invited by my partner up on the stage, but there weren't a whole lot of scientists invited, and we could have more next year. And I think you'd find quite a few who've either written books they'd like to talk about. I know Siddhartha Mukherjee has a new book next year, and there'll be others as well. So I think part of it is the opportunity to speak, and I would argue that festivals of ideas like this, and maybe this shouldn't be called a literary festival, maybe you should call it an ideas festival. There are meetings in America these days, often sponsored by very rich people who fly everybody in and have these kinds of think tanks, which the focus is not just literature, it's also economics and foreign affairs and science and technology. Because it would have been quite good here to have had not just me responding to some accusations about the bad behavior of pharmaceutical companies, but to have had some leaders of that industry say, well, we do a lot of good things and we make drugs that people want, and you could have had a much more lively debate. I do think that while it's convenient to say scientists don't want to be public intellectuals, that there are a lot of scientists who would like to be public intellectuals and indeed are willing to do so if they get invited. My friend, the actor Alan Alda, has created a center for scientific communication out in one of the State University of New York campuses. And his goal is to train people who are in science to be more effective communicators, to communicate to each other at scientific meetings, but importantly, to spread the culture of science. I think I mentioned the other day that in New York City we now have an annual science fair. It attracts hundreds of thousands of people. There are 20 or more venues all over the New York City going on all the time, doing things from illustrating technical advances to talking about the ethical dilemmas presented by science, to talking about the future of our species and how science can help fend off disaster. I deeply encourage other countries to try to emulate that kind of festival, which didn't begin in New York. Actually, one of the first was in Genoa and in Italy, and there's several around the country, I believe, and around the world. And it's a very effective way to get young people excited about science and to treat their parents and grandparents about what science has produced. Over here.
Hi, I'm an educational researcher, so in that sense, do you have any opinions on how science has been traditionally taught and how it should be taught?
Yes. The question, I know science was taught to me very badly in high school. I had no interest in being a scientist based on what my chemistry teacher, my biology teacher, who was mainly really the football coach, was trying to tell me about the basic rules of that had been discovered 50 years ago, and I never learned that science is not a list of discoveries. It's a series of acts of intellectual pursuit and asking questions and trying to answer questions. And as soon as I got into a laboratory and began to understand that what is really fascinating about science is where it's created a frontier between what we know and what we'd like to know. And I'm not alone among my scientist colleagues in feeling that I don't really care about what I published last year. What I really care about is the answer to the question that I'm trying to study now. As soon as somebody begins to understand that science is a series of acts of discovery, and being the first to understand something that is an important question at the time, then you get interested. And there are ways to do that. There are new kinds of curriculum that start in elementary school that teach kids how to ask an experimental question. I think basically if I were in charge of an educational program, I would say let's teach virtually everything through science. Get kids do experiments. They can do a little reading they can learn reading, they can learn writing, they can learn the act of gathering evidence and drawing conclusions. The act of teamwork, one thing we haven't talked about that is important, is the fact that almost all science goes on as a team activity, either within a single laboratory or as a result of interactions among laboratories, even within different institutions, that the scientific community works together. We have probably more meetings than we should, but the act of getting together to talk to other folks is really critical to this process. And once people began to see how communal science is, competitive, yes, but not competitive in the sense that every individual is standing on his or her own, but that everyone's struggling to get answers, and the communal activity of trying to share how far we've gotten is something that gets people excited about science and makes them feel that, just like any other activity in life, economics or politics, that there is a dynamic. It's not a static process. And that's the kind of educational atmosphere that I think we have not been very good at creating in the US or anywhere else.
Any questions?
Someone in the back over here.
You have been studying, you have studied medicine very seriously. In the arena of medicine, I find we hear that scientists are trying to extend the human life to 100 years, to 200 years, to 300 years, and tremendous amount of resources are being expended to that extent. Do you, as a doctor, feel that this is worthwhile to extend human life to the limit of 200 years or 300 years?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I am, to the distress of some of my close colleagues who've started companies to extend human life, I'm not a great proponent of that. I think it's important to address the diseases that I believe are fundamentally treatable, and those do include not just cancers, which I've talked about, and infectious diseases where we've already had a lot of successes, but also diseases like the degenerative diseases of the brain, Alzheimer's and so forth. But to say we should now, before we've conquered those diseases, try to extend life by a large number of years, I don't think that should be the major focus of medical research. And indeed, it's not. I mean, there are a few companies that are trying to extend life. There is some effort at the NIH, but a very small effort. I do think that trying to understand the principles of aging at this stage is useful, because many aspects of aging are closely linked to disease. Cancer is a disease of aging, but I do believe that cancer can be prevented and treated, and if we understand the principles of aging that apply to the generation of a cancer, we'll be that much closer to controlling a disease which often kills people at very early ages. So I think we need to think carefully what we mean by the term aging. If it's simply to extend life before we've been able to deal with the causes of senility, we're going to end up with a totally intractable, unlivable situation in which we have a large number of very old, non-functional individuals using the resources that are generated by a shrunken labor force. And that's an economic issue that is very troubling and is already imperiling the economies of many countries.
I think, wrap up the questioning, but before we come to a close, what kind of things are interesting you next, and what are the exciting things that you're looking forward to?
Well, my life is bipartite in a sense that some of it is involved with trying to help people set major directions in research, and try to encourage folks to work together, to encourage a greater interest in doing research that matters in developing countries. So I spend a lot of my time doing that kind of thing. But I also have a laboratory, and I still remain interested in many aspects of how normal cells become cancer cells, the question that I really started my scientific career trying to pursue. The precise nature of the kinds of things we do experimentally has changed because our tools have changed. What we know about cancer is so much richer and deeper. And the kinds of things that my own trainees work on is very different than it was 30 or 40 years ago. For example, we're thinking about novel ways to make cancer cells die, not just by blocking the action of bad proteins, but actually increasing their activity so that it's so bad that the cell dies. So that's one general concept that sometimes goes underappreciated as a way to think about cancer therapy. So there are always new questions. Science is an unending litany of exciting things to try to address, and I still remain quite addicted to the idea of getting new results to try to interpret and bring to my friends. Francis Crick, one of the scientists who discovered the double helix of DNA, is famous for saying that the critical thing in deciding what you want to work on is deciding whether or not it makes good gossip. And so he said the gossip factor was the critical thing for him. And when he was a physicist interested in switching to biology, he could feel that he was excited about trying to tell his colleagues what he was thinking about genes and about DNA. And he knew he had to study DNA because the gossip factor was such a critical component of trying to make a choice about what to work on as a scientist.
Well, Dr. Harold Varmus, thank you very much. I think time is up. But we hope you'll come back to Bangladesh many times more, and look forward to continuing this conversation.
Well, if life is extended to a reasonable period of time, then I'll be able to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.